pleasant day to everyone. We are pleased to have you join us in this regional dialogue on unlocking private sector potential for forest and landscape management and sustainability through jurisdictional sustainability approach. My name is Cristina Corrales, Program Specialist of the Emerging Innovation for Growth Department of SEARCA, and I will be your moderator for today's event. SEARCA, in collaboration with FAO, actually conducted 2 learning events related to jurisdictional sustainability approach. The first is a forum held February 18, 2021, where we introduced the concept of JSA and its applicability to forest management. The second is a regional side event during the Asia Pacific Climate Week, which was conducted last July 7, 2021, wherein we looked into the potential of JSA for forest and climate financing. Today's regional event is designed to specifically identify areas of collaboration with the private sector for the operationalization of jurisdictional approach. Please also allow me to mention that we have participants from the academe, government, and industry sectors across Southeast Asia. We have attendees from Malaysia, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Indonesia, Singapore, Ghana, Bangladesh, India, and of course from the Philippines. So let us take a look at our program, which is currently being shown on your screen. After my introduction and a few house rules and messages from SEARCA and FAO, we will have 2 speakers to present the opportunities and challenges of jurisdictional approach for forest and landscape management. So we will have Mr. Philip Summers will discuss what does JA look like for nesting RED projects and its implications for forest financing, to be followed by Ms. Imelda Bacudo to present the Philippines case study. To discuss the role of the private sector on climate financing, we will have Mr. Lucio Santos to provide a presentation on this topic. For this session, 3 panelists from the private sector will be joining us. We have Mr. Josh Van Vianen, Mr. Aditya Rachman, and Ms. Susana Velez Holler. And this session will be moderated by Dr. Rico Ancom. The panel session will be followed by insights and reactions from our discussant, Ms. Reagan Pyro-Mahaki. And after all the presentations, we will open the floor to your questions and clarifications. And finally, the event will be concluded with a synthesis from Dr. Nathaniel Bantayan. So just a few house rules for us to remember throughout the event. We would like to encourage everyone to please observe proper chat etiquette. Only post questions or comments related to the topic or to the presentation, and always use courteous language. And for your questions and clarifications, kindly send your questions via Zoom's Q&A box located at the menu bar on your screen. Kindly indicate your location and or your country of origin. So please be clear when you are posing a question to a specific presenter, or if it is a general question that anybody can respond to. So you may also ask the questions live. Kindly use the raise hand feature and wait to be acknowledged during our open forum, and our team will enable you to use your microphone. Okay, so please note also that this event will be recorded and will be made available on SEARCA's Facebook page and YouTube channel. Okay, without further ado, to officially open our event, may we introduce to you the SEARCA Director and Academician of the Philippine National Academy of Science and Technology, Dr. Glenn B. Gregorio, to give the welcome remarks.
Thank you, Christine. and a pleasant Monday morning from the science and nature city of Los Baños. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to this regional dialogue on a very complicated title, Unlocking Private Sector Potential, or I will say engagement of our private sector for forest and landscape management and sustainability through jurisdictional sustainability approach. So it's a mouthful, but this is more on engaging our private sector to our landscape management using the GSA approach. Similar with many of our activities, we are holding this event virtually due to the limitation brought by COVID-19 pandemic. But thank you for the technology that made this possible with less cost. Actually, we have to look at the positive side. Less cost, more participation. This will also show how unyielding and committed you and the institutions that you represent in pursuing effective forest and natural resources management. A growing demand of emission reduction from the forest and land use has been evident for the past years. We realize that the private sectors plays a significant role in offsetting carbon emission. Many industries have increased their investment in mitigating activities in the forest and land use and started to adopt practices towards conservation and sustainability. But it should and does not stop there. We should do more. There are lots of potential that can still be unlocked, or many more engagement that we could all be involved here. This sustainability commitment can provide a strong leverage to engage in jurisdictional sustainability approach, or JSA, a large-scale sustainable development that is climate-friendly, equitable, and provides social inclusion across large landscapes. In the Philippines, the so-called, you called it the RED Plus, or Reducing Emission from Deforestation and Forest Degradation project, were implemented in the provinces of Palawan, in the province of Albay, Southern Leyte, our neighbor province, Quezon, Cagayan region. We have the Eastern Samar and Davao Oriental. The National Greening Program that covers more than 1 million hectares of land from 2011 to 2016 has been scaled out. They started from that, and it's now being scaled out to all the remaining unproductive, denuded, and degraded forest land, and has extended up to, we have a chance now to extend it from 2016 to 2028. So it's still long, but we have to act now. Building on the results and the lesson from this RED Plus project and NGP, SEARCA, as commissioned by FAO, has been studying the feasibility of developing a jurisdictional sustainability approach in Palawan, Philippines, for the management and monitoring of forest climate finance investments. The details result of the study will be presented later, so you will have all the details later. This jurisdictional sustainability approach presents a collaborative opportunity which necessitates the concerted action of the private sectors, government, and stakeholders in providing climate financing for climate adaptation and mitigation initiatives. This is very much in line with the academe, industry, government interconnectivity approach that SEARCA is highly advocating. So, as the focus of this event, we hope to further understand how the private sectors can take the front line by advancing the GSA in various industries. Let me take this opportunity to extend our gratitude and appreciation to our partners from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and to all the participants today. May the learnings from this dialogue lead us to a better, bigger, smarter outcomes and impact that is highly relevant to our forest and beyond. Again, thank you. God bless you all.
Thank you very much, Director Gregorio, for that warm welcome. And to deliver a short message from UNFAO, and perhaps to enlighten us why jurisdictional approach is something of interest, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Matthew Van Rijn, Forestry Officer at the FAO Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific.
Good morning to all. Dr. Glenn Gregorio, Director of SEARCA, distinguished guests and colleagues. On behalf of FAO, I'm delighted to have a few remarks at the workshop Unlocking Private Sector Potential for Forest and Landscape Management under Sustainability through Jurisdictional Sustainability Approach. In order to meet the Paris Agreement and limit temperature rise, eradicating deforestation and degradation, and promoting forest rehabilitation and sustainable land use in tropical regions represents a crucial step towards that goal. However, the problem remains that today this is not yet happening at the pace and scale needed. Private investment capital offers the potential to fill a shortfall. While new potential sources of investment capital are coming online, they are struggling to connect with investable initiatives. This can be partly by a lack of confidence of the investors, capacity of the country or jurisdiction to measure, monitor, and report credible information on climate change initiative, or while jurisdictional projects or initiatives are not well embedded in national frameworks. The project under which the current workshop is organized aims to address information barriers associated with harnessing public and private investment to scale up these national determined contribution actions in a way that can benefit local jurisdictions and land users. A baseline assessment of jurisdictional sustainability was conducted in Palawan, the Philippines, to explore the feasibility of establishing an operational pilot of jurisdictional level platform for the management and monitoring of forest and landscape climate finance investments. Findings of the studies will be presented today in the workshop, and Palawan constitutes a large island, which makes it an interesting case to study a jurisdictional approach. There was indication that several private sector stakeholders were exploring Palawan as an area for restoration projects, which is one of the reasons why Palawan was chosen for the study. A second part of the project is to consult with the private sector on landscape finance to assess investor needs, identify barriers that need to be addressed, and data or information required to leverage investments. Today's workshop is to provide such avenue for knowledge sharing from private sector stakeholders on possible actions and collaboration through a jurisdictional sustainability. And ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I would like to express my gratitude to our partners SEARCA for arranging this workshop, and express appreciation to everyone for participating in today's event. I wish you a very fruitful meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for that opening remarks and for setting the tone of our dialogue. So moving on to our distinguished speakers and their presentations, please allow me to introduce to you our first speaker. Mr. Philip Summers is a consultant with in-depth experience of the supporting countries to develop responses to climate change, in particular actions linked to the land use sector. Phil has over 15 years of experience working with national and subnational governments, development agencies, NGOs, and the private sector. His recent work has focused extensively on the development of the global mechanism on reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, or REDD+, where he has worked across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific. He is currently engaged in supporting the design of a nesting structure in PNG and has provided advice to government and private sector globally on how to develop effective responses to nesting as part of action on climate change. So here to answer the question on what does jurisdictional approach look like for nesting REDD projects and its implications for forest financing, please welcome Mr. Summers.
Thank you very much, Christina, and once again, welcome and thank you very much, Director Gregorio and SEARCA for hosting this event. I think it's a very interesting topic and comes at a very important time in the development of the forest financing and also landscape financing period. I'm just checking the presentation is going to come up as well. And I certainly commend FAO and the work of SEARCA on conducting these studies within the Philippines, as well as developing the approach more broadly. And I think this event is a real showcase opportunity for seeing how the nesting approach and the jurisdictional approach can be developed in more detail. So, an exciting point in time. Christina, can I if you're running the presentation from your end, or you're expecting it to come up from my end?
We can share it for you, Phil.
Okay, thank you.
For a while.
So just as a short introduction to myself, so as Christina mentioned, my name is Phil Summers. I'm director of a small consulting business based out of Brisbane, where we specialize in looking at environmental finance and the interaction between particularly national and subnational policies and measures in various areas around the agricultural supply chain, the work around forest carbon, and that is integration with a lot of work done in Papua New Guinea and also internationally in Southeast Asia and Africa. It was a pleasure to be invited to speak at today's event. And when I was looking at I started drafting a presentation, and when I looked at the following presentations, I thought that maybe I would provide us, because the presentations coming later in the morning, I think will give us a much more detailed look at what jurisdictional approaches do look like, because it's where people are trying to actually implement them on the ground. So I've tried to stay at a high level to give an overview and set the scene for the day. So we can go to the first slide. Next slide. So in terms of what is a jurisdictional approach, I think it's important here to break out some of the language that is used, because there are lots of terms being used in terms of jurisdictional approaches, and within that often conflates a number of different methodologies and ways of approaching jurisdictional approaches that cover carbon as a commodity, as well as agricultural supply chains. So if looking at the definitions broadly, there are a number of key elements within a jurisdictional approach that based on recognized government jurisdictions, so provinces, districts, or national boundaries. It has a full level of government engagement, I put lead some areas that it seems that there's a centrally government-led approach, whereas in other areas, government is a participant within a process. And they seek to address landscape change at scale and adopt a whole of landscape approach. So it will be looking at those different areas as a whole landscape, as opposed to looking at small projects within there. And it is, let's say, important to differentiate between these different types of jurisdictional approach, or how these jurisdictional approaches are set. Holistic framework that includes lots of different jurisdictional certification processes. Next slide. So why are jurisdictional approaches relevant? Well, they're seen as addressing a number of limitations in the existing site or project-based approaches, whether that be for agricultural systems, agricultural certification, or carbon-based projects, particularly REDD+ projects. Critical within it is an enhanced level of government engagement by working at a jurisdictional scale. The approach is fundamentally looking to utilize government tools to change the way land use decision making is made. And so government is at the center of the process, and that helps to frame a more sustainable, potentially, approach, and also an approach that is able to achieve scale. There's a relevance in terms of access to markets at scale. By working at a jurisdictional scale, often you're working across much larger landscapes, and therefore facilitating a bigger programs where they are able to deliver higher levels of credit or increase agricultural supply chains or other elements, and so able to access a market at scale, as opposed to being more of a kind of boutique product. And that helps these elements be mainstreamed. And I think it's something we'll come back to when we're talking about the finance, certainly later in the presentation and also later in the morning. It also helps to address many of the challenges that are faced by project scale activities in terms of social and environmental integrity. This comes in terms of particularly additionality within the carbon sphere. So if you're looking at whether a project is actually creating an additional benefit, so it's something that was not going to happen anyway. It helps fit baselines and information within national frameworks and jurisdictional structure. And if we look at evidence of this so far, that is related, it will cause baselines to be a lot more conservative, and therefore any gains against those baselines to be seen as more justified and more additional. It also helps to address issues of leakage, because you're working at this larger scale. You're helping to prevent it being a situation where only a point issue is addressed, with deforestation or degradation occurring in the areas around that. And also, as you're working at a scale and within government policy and creating changes in the way land use decision making is made, it also helps address reversals, because there is a bigger infrastructure and bigger structural change in the way the land use decision making is made. And finally, by having a structure that is again at scale, it helps reduce pressure on land and indigenous people's rights, because you're less focused on specific locations and changing the land use in a specific location, and more about the way land use decision making is made across us all, and the rights and responsibilities of indigenous peoples. Finally, it also provides as an opportunity for things to be established at an operational scale. We've seen that projects are able to be operationalized because they work in discrete areas. In many places, national scale implementation of things like REDD and any other form of agricultural certification has been very difficult to achieve due to the sheer diversity of most countries and the challenges of developing something at that scale. Whereas at a jurisdiction or a subnational scale, often there is a much higher opportunity to develop the appropriate policies and approaches that can move towards an integrated approach at that landscape level. That hopefully in time will scale up to the national level, but at present provides a sort of interim step in that direction. And these elements help them to be seen as a real opportunity for moving forest finance, carbon finance, and also agricultural finance and agricultural commitments to zero or net zero deforestation supply chains for many companies financing. We can go to the next slide. So what does this mean for finance? With the adoption of jurisdictional approaches presents a number of opportunities and challenges. As discussed, the scale is a key opportunity. Many buyers looking for emissions reductions or looking to invest significantly in agricultural supply chains are seeking to do so at a large scale, as that reduces the transaction costs of operation and helps that they need. And so operating at a jurisdictional scale really helps support that process and long-term agreements with different groups. It also provides a better opportunity for using a range of financial instruments that are available to government to incentivize action. We've seen several of these being put in place within Brazil, linked to access to loans and access to finance, as well as use of subsidies and tax regimes that have helped to incentivize different uses of land with the private sector. Sort of instruments that are often, in many cases, relatively low cost to implement, but help create a different incentive structure for the private sector investment. And that provides those opportunities are often just not available at a project scale or lower level. In terms of challenges, however, there is a need for these jurisdictional approaches to be effectively nested and sit. Carbon accounting, how that accounting system is structured to make sure that there is an alignment between a jurisdictional scale and a national scale approach. And also working at a jurisdictional scale, you are still working through a larger number of stakeholders in many cases, and you often have to address a more complex benefit sharing and implementation environment than you would do within one community group or one private sector group. And that has often presented a challenge, particularly for promoting private sector investment, as it's often seen as a risky environment and also linked to some of the. So it creates an opportunity. There are risks that come with that process. So as a final thing, we're talking about what's happened next. We said there are significant opportunities that exist for scaling up action and finance within the adoption of a jurisdictional approach. I think some of the things that are needed to come and move this process forward are bringing together the different groups that are at an international level looking at jurisdictional approaches, and how these can be mainstreamed into something that is operationalized at a site level. So for example, if you're looking at jurisdictional scale certification for agricultural products, how does that link with the jurisdictional RED approach? And how is a government and a jurisdictional level government engaged in that process and incentivized to participate, and particularly helping those levels of government understand what the opportunities and challenges of that structure are. And also helping private sector understand how they can fully engage and what tools and policy options might be available to driving further investment. And so I think there's a call maybe for, certainly within a number of areas that I've worked in, is a call for more action and support through the international community and between those different groups to help look at how to package effectively these sort of jurisdictional scale approaches that combine different supply chain elements and different products into something that is, or a set of tools that can be used and considered within these. Very important because they provide an opportunity for us to look at what is happening, what the lessons are coming out of those processes, and how those can be developed further to help support jurisdictions in moving towards developing their own approaches and how they can. So as I say, this is a very high level overview of some of the issues that I think we're going to talk about this morning. And once again, I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak, and I'm excited and interested very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Summers, for your presentation. Mr. Summers mentioned that there are significant opportunities in pursuing a jurisdictional approach, but there are also risks or challenges associated with it. He emphasized that there is a need to enhance coordination at the local and international level for a JA or jurisdictional approach to be effective. So thank you again, Mr. Summers, for your presentation. Our next speaker is Ms. Imelda Bacudo, or Dada as she is known to friends. Ms. Bacudo provides technical advice to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and its 10 member states for strengthened regional and international policies to gain wider access to climate finance. She has been instrumental in the formation and operations of the ASEAN Climate Resilience Network, a platform for knowledge exchange and support to promote low emissions and adaptations in agriculture. She remains the technical guiding advisor to ASEAN Negotiating Group for Agriculture, which negotiates for this sector at the UNFCCC level. As an independent consultant, Ms. Dada works for GIZ, UNFAO Regional Asia Pacific Office, EU ASEAN, UNEP Climate and Clean Air Coalition, among others. Now based in Bali, Indonesia, Ms. Dada has over 20 years of experience in the areas of biodiversity conservation, sustainable development, and conservation finance in the Philippines. He also worked in America, Uganda, and Southeast Asia, working with NGOs, national governments, and international development agencies. So ladies and gentlemen, here to discuss the relevant findings from the Philippine case study, please welcome Ms. Bacudo.
Thank you, Tin. And you didn't have to read my whole LinkedIn profile, but good morning to everyone. I had the pleasure of sharing some of the results of our mini study on the feasibility of a JSA in Palawan as chosen. Please allow me to share my screen. All right, so thank you everyone. As mentioned earlier, this is a commissioned study from FAO looking at the feasibility of a jurisdictional level platform for Palawan. And I think my colleagues ahead has explained why FAO has thought this is important in this moment to look at the possibility. I would like to say that this is really not promoting JSA, but just really looking at the possibility of this, if this is even implementable for Palawan in particular. The assignment mandated us to look at the elements needed for an operational example for jurisdictional approach in Palawan. I'm speaking on behalf of a 5-member team where we are composed of Dr. Rico Angco, myself, Dr. Rodolfo Abalos, Dr. Nathaniel Bantayan, and Mr. Paul Ramirez, each contributing our own expertise into the study. I suppose that there has been discussion shared earlier, especially from Matthew of FAO, on why this issue is very compelling at the moment. And several initiatives were already developed to mitigate the impact of climate change, such as the NDCs, and especially how countries are hastening now to really comply with their commitments to the NDCs. However, we are still looking at major concerns on the lack of MRV mechanisms that are implemented, which could assure investors of a bit of a safe investment. NDCs are at the moment also in the process of reformulation, and we can still say that there's a lack of confidence in the investors in the countries, in not just Philippines, but several countries' capacity to monitor, measure, and report greenhouse gas emissions. So this study aims to look at example of a jurisdictional level, and the work also explores opportunities for quantitative evaluation for forest monitoring. We have produced an inception report looking at all the key elements that would be needed for a jurisdictional approach. We have done this in a method that includes various consultations with stakeholders at the national and at the regional level, constantly calling and in touch as well with the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development and the Department of Environment, among other stakeholders. So we hope that our output will come up with baseline assessment of jurisdictional sustainability and opportunities for jurisdictional sustainability profile for Palawan. One of the key elements for jurisdictional sustainability, as we found out, I would like to state that we are all new to the term jurisdictional sustainability. When we went around conducting this study, we found out, even from like DNR, from stakeholders, that we are all together new and trying to define the meaning of jurisdictional sustainability apart from the textbook definition that we can find, and apart from, let's say, Red Plus expert or forestry experts at international forestry centers. So one of the key elements we found is really an overhaul or an overview of the forest resources and management in Palawan, Philippines. Key to this is looking at the laws. So key to this is looking at the forest status and forest policies, looking at what are programs that exist that shows already large-scale forest monitoring, management, and program, and possible MRV system, as we see with this being developed, the carbon accounting verification system. So in the report, you will see this, an overview of all the forest status and forest policy laws. You could see that there are various policies put in place in the Philippines, engaging multi-stakeholders and involving the private sector at different spatial scales that identifies tenural rights and resource use, ensuring conservation of biodiversity, applying a monitoring system, more importantly, implemented under governance structure. You can see the forest policies from 1575 onwards. I think from timber licensing agreements to the National Integrated Protected Area System, and several Red Plus strategy. But what's important is also we looked at the strategic environmental plan for Palawan, which is a special law governing the whole province of Palawan, and it's implemented by the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development. And we have an analysis later on of how these regional policies are also very much aligned with national, and sometimes also creating the need for harmonization of these several laws governing resource management in Palawan. In this section, we also look at a large-scale forest management program that the government has been implementing for quite some time now, which is called the National Greening Program. Before I continue talking, Tin, can you just remind me if I'm being heard quite well?
Yes, Miss Dada, you are.
Okay, perfect. I just don't want to keep going on. So the National Greening Program is one of a large-scale forest management program that we decided to have a look on in looking for lessons at large-scale forest management program. So it has been quite successful in terms of accomplishment of rehabilitating 2,031,000 hectares. In Palawan, it has 272 areas, equivalent to 8,933 hectares. The private sector has a lot of role in this kind of program, but there is also the cooperation, of course, with the local government units, the cooperatives, and the NGOs. In Palawan, this program has 90 sites that went into partnership with the National Greening Program. And we also had a look at the advantages of this program and challenges faced by this National Greening Program. This is a program of the Philippine bureaucracy and has its full support. And we looked at its advantage as possibly providing the least risk for private sector involvement. We cannot ascertain, but if it's directly related, but FAO in 2015 ranked the Philippines as the 5th worldwide in forest cover gain. But we were not sure if this is directly linked to this program, but it surely is helpful. We also look at, there has been several RED Plus projects in the Philippines, and lessons learned from them has already been available. And it has applied a monitoring system already. And there are several achievements based on these national RED Plus strategies, and several projects already, including built-up areas have increased threefold from 2003 to 2015. Closed forests decreased though, and there's slight decrease in mangrove forest. The Philippine National RED Plus strategies, the lessons learned from them gives us a glimpse on enabling policies, the governance system, resources allocation and management, looking at measurable MRV system and reportable conditions, and sustainable financing. So when we look at models, we have these two programs to look into. But at the moment, we are also looking at the big potential of the carbon accounting verification certification systems for forest carbon projects. At the moment, it is a technical guide being prepared by the Forest Management Bureau and provides the details on setting up a monitoring system, which we think is a key element if the province of Palawan wants to go ahead with a jurisdictional sustainability approach. It could be applied in forest lands, mineral lands, national parks, NIPAS areas, or the National Integrated Protected Areas, and private lands. We also look at, of course, multi-stakeholder governance. Who are the stakeholders here? And we could look at, as I said, we're looking at several programs here where multi-stakeholder partnerships have been enforced or implemented. We're looking at the community-based forest management, the RED Plus pilot projects, and the National Greening Program. We could see the key actors here For the community-based forest management, CBFM, it is being undertaken by cooperatives, and stakeholders include a huge chunk of the indigenous people and their organizations, local communities, local government units, the Department of Environment, the Palawan Council for Sustainable Developments, other government offices, and NGOs. For project level RED Plus pilot projects, you could see the key actors from the national government would include the Department of Environment and the Forest Management Bureau, the Climate Change Commission, the National Council for Indigenous People, the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development, and municipal local government unit at that level, and the village level, which we call barangay level. Then there are many also stakeholders, tribal councils, farmer groups, women, private landowners, the RED Plus community practitioners, and the national and provincial multi-stakeholders. There's a very big project in Palawan on flora and fauna with EU support. And these are the implementers, FFI, Conservation International, and there is a task force created for that also works with these projects called Non-Timber Forest Products Task Force. The National Greening Program, you could imagine who are, it's almost the same key stakeholders with the addition of the key critical role of the Department of Agriculture's participation here, but the Department of Environment is the implementing agency. Other stakeholders that we could see in the whole of Palawan that could have a critical role in resource management are these government ministries, including mines and geosciences. There's a lot of mining activities in Palawan. There's also the National Economic Development Authority, irrigation, the Biodiversity Management Bureau, and the Provincial Cooperative Development Office. Company and groups, here are the list of those engaged in the private sector. And as we said, there's really a lot of mining industries in Palawan, and there's also a lot of sustainable agriculture groups. Cashew is a big figure, cacao, coffee, banana, rubber, and livestock in the whole of Palawan. Then we also have a climate finance aspect that we look not necessarily on forest management, but on overall resource management. We could have a combination if we're looking together at all possibilities of financing streams. They're coming currently from reforestation grants, conservation grants, readiness grants, public spending on infrastructures. And there is also a big figure, especially from tourism, from environmental user fees, climate smart agriculture initiatives, and there are also loans. So these are like the menu of climate finance opportunities matrix for Palawan. So finally, after looking at all these elements, we thought, okay, how does jurisdictional sustainability approach look like in Palawan? It's a hard question to answer as we all struggle to put a picture together. What we start with learning from example, what we have already in Palawan is 50,000 hectares in southern Palawan through the EU supported project. And we draw lessons learned from there on how the possibility of jurisdictional approach can be implemented. But beyond the lessons learned from on governance aspect, from the RED Plus projects that existed in Palawan. We're also looking at an example of how a jurisdictional approach was implemented in the state of Acre in Brazil, one of more famous example of this. It was only possible when the governor went to really make a big announcement and said that they are going to target this much hectares of forest and reduce carbon dioxide emissions by this much tons in exchange for the state taking actions. And with this quite emotional and very large scale announcement and very big support from the government and from the jurisdiction of the state of Brazil, they were able to generate funds from the German government. So in essence, we are saying that it is up to the jurisdiction and the stake and the governor of the province of Palawan to make this step. But should PCSD or Palawan make this step, the province of Palawan make this step, here are the elements that they need to consider. These are the menu of elements that we gathered from C4, Center for International Forestry. Of course, there is still the absence of an integrated low emissions rural development strategy with climate ambitions and target. This is key for approaching a jurisdictional sustainability approach. This would be very big because then it would harmonize and enrich existing localized plans. And we all know that harmonization of several laws governing resource management in Palawan has been an endeavor at least in the last 2 decades. So there are many challenges ahead of this, but we think that funding can be sourced in order to develop in order to support the development of this one comprehensive plan that would that will cover the targets of what the province of Palawan would want if they want to do this. There should be an existence of a spatial plan, and we do see the existence of these plans through the environmental critical areas network, a spatial development framework in the province of Palawan. So these exist, several spatial plans exist, and you can see it in our report. The MRV system, we see that coming from CAVCS, and as well as there are also several MRV system present in within being developed by FMB, the Forest Management Bureau. How this could be operationalized at the provincial level is still a question for us, for all of us, but there is the existence of a plan. Policies and incentives. There are various policies on reforestation and forest management in Palawan, but incentives have not been very much expressed or articulated. Our incentives, we feel, should be incorporated, as most policies focus on penalties versus rewards. So lessons learned from RED Plus projects in the country should be considered, such as inclusion of co-benefits. There are, however, safeguards coming from existing policies, such as those from the Philippine Environmental Impact Statement System and the Strategic Environment Plan for Palawan Act. Multi-stakeholder governance, there is the presence of that, but as Phil Summers mentioned, the challenge really is in coordination. Sustainable agriculture, there are many projects in Palawan on this, but there is a general movement to seem to promote greater added value and to improve competitiveness of locally produced commodities, which we think is a good direction. Of course, jurisdictional sustainability approach, according to this standard created by C4, should really involve indigenous peoples and local communities. And in Palawan, there are very active NGOs and tribal councils, and the IPRA, or the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, is also one method of ensuring their participation. So financing appears to be very limited as of the moment, but there is substantial potential for big companies, particularly from multinational companies and conglomerates. So this is still an aspect. This has been discussed in our paper, and our climate finance expert had looked at how many companies have initiated and continued environmental programs and projects with pre-planting or reforestation as the prime activity in many parts of the country. As I speak, I believe there are also many new projects coming together for Palawan on reforestation in partnerships with banks, with the private sector. So these are also being taken into consideration. The opportunities really is that it has to be stressed that indigenous peoples and local communities are largely involved in regional decision-making process, and there should be availability and diversity of financing to support and incentivize this development. We feel in Palawan, it is very much in the early stage, especially of the financing, greater coordination of all financing streams should be undertaken. And we end this with the saying that with the finding and the conclusion that it is the decision of the provincial government of Palawan if they wish to undertake jurisdictional sustainability approach. And with that, I hope I did good by presenting the major parts of our study, and I welcome my teammates if they want to mention anything that I might have missed. Thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, Tin.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dada, for presenting the major findings of the study. Ms. Dada presented the findings from the forest assessment, from the stakeholder assessment, and also Ms. Dada identified the important elements of JSA that Palawan should take into consideration should they decide to pursue a jurisdictional approach. So thank you again, Ms. Dada. Moving on to the panel discussion, and now focusing on the role of the private sector on climate financing. Our third speaker is Mr. Lucio Santos. Mr. Santos is the Climate Finance Red Plus Officer at FAO for almost 7 years. He has a degree in agricultural engineering with master's degree in environmental science and rural development. He provides technical guidance on Red Plus Finance, including results-based payments and public investments to reduce deforestation and forest degradation. Ms. Santos has more than 15 years of experience in climate change and forest, and before joining FAO, he was involved in climate change negotiations and MRV processes under UNFCCC for Red Plus and land use change, and forestry topics. So unfortunately, Mr. Santos cannot attend our event since it is around 3 or 4 a.m. in Italy right now, but he is kind enough to record his presentation for us. So let us all watch his pre-recording as he talks about climate finance and the role of private sectors.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this workshop. I will make a presentation on climate finance, the role of the private sector, and how can governments enable private sector action in forest and land use. First of all, it were to highlight that there is urgent need of advocacy for and commitments to adequate and predictable finance to sustainably manage all types of forests and for fostering the capacity of forests to act as a climate solution. Currently, yearly average investments in land-based mitigation and adaptation measures are $21 billion. This is only 3.6% of the total flow of climate finance, or 133 billion for nature-based solutions. In any case, this number, the estimated gap is 4 to 6 times the amount invested today. In the graph, we observe the proportion of finance differentiated between public and private for the total of climate finance and for the total of nature-based solutions. We can see that the private sector is underrepresented, only 14%. Therefore, one of the opportunities to cover the finance gaps is the increase of investment from the private sector. So where are the opportunities to increase the private sector investments? On one hand, an increasing number of companies have adopted a responsible business policy, defining goals and process to reduce the potential negative impacts of their activities. In the case of companies relying on commodities produced in forest landscapes, the implementation of those corporate policies can represent an opportunity to fund actions to reduce pressure on forests and foster forest positive production models. On the other hand, numerous companies are committed to reducing or compensating their climate footprint and are likely to adopt strategies for offsetting or insetting their carbon emissions. So the implementation of their commitments will then generate financial flows for emerging carbon markets or activities of forest conservation and restoration directly linked with these companies' supply chain. Here are some numbers to illustrate this potential. For example, in the first 8 months of 2021, voluntary carbon markets have already posted a near 60% increase in value from last year, driven by corporate net zero ambition and growing interest in carbon markets to achieve Paris Agreement targets. All this, despite of the pandemic, the voluntary carbon market is on track of growth for annual market value prediction to reach $1 billion in 2021 for the first time. Obviously, if the current levels of activity continue. By sector, forestry and land use and renewable energy had the largest market value among voluntary carbon market. This is with numbers from 2019. And from the demand side, consumer goods and finance insurance sector had the greatest demand in 2021, driven by a rapid acceleration of net zero and carbon neutral commitments. So as we can see, there are opportunities that also lead some complexities. For example, also here in the background, you can see information on REDD+ related projects. In blue, projects on avoid deforestation, and in orange, projects on enhancement of carbon stocks. The size of the circle is indicative of offsets issued. So in relation with the RED Plus related projects, we see that they have increased in number and results. They also may overlap with jurisdictional initiatives compromises environmental integrity. But if challenges are addressed, private sector engagement can be leveraged to enhance actions and finance, and opens opportunities to connect them with carbon finance options becomes. Some lessons are being learned from current government responses in terms of the role of private sector and finance for modalities to access carbon finance incentives, requirements, and responsibilities, and in terms of supporting regulatory frameworks. Here, some consideration for the governments in order to enable the participation of private finance. First, how can the measured emission reductions from projects be consistent across scales? How can countries ensure that projects are aligned and synergic with national initiatives or national or jurisdictional initiatives? How can private sector action or investment be incentivized through the carbon finance? And how can governments respond effectively and contain the cost and complexity of resulting regulatory framework? Now, some responses for the first two questions. For incentivizing private sector actions, governments can set up regulations, procedures, and institutional arrangements. Here in some elements of potential policy response. So the graph illustrate the regulation and processes established by a number of countries to address issues related to nesting of projects and jurisdictional approaches. Some of these elements will be more critical depending on the specific option that the country wishes to enable. So they are not intended to be prescriptive, but as an example of potential taxonomy of elements for countries to consider when addressing these different challenges. When I mention the specific options that country wishes to enable, I am making reference, for example, if the jurisdictional approach will allow the direct access to carbon finance by projects, or indirect access through benefit sharing arrangements will be established, or options related to the MRV systems, if the regulations will allow independent MRV system by projects, or regulated provision on MRV system will be established by the government. This regulation and processes to address issues related to nesting of projects in jurisdictional approach can be described broadly, classified around these 6 elements that are shown in the graph. First, benefit sharing and carbon rights arrangements that should establish a set of rules and mechanisms that define the way projects can be rewarded. This element may also include provisions of whether and how projects would engage in carbon transactions, either at national or international level. Then the second is the project approval process. That is the core mechanism by which countries are being able to identify, assess, track, set condition and an obligation to projects. Establishment of these elements enable countries to ensure that any new project proposal or vintage project can be assessed against national determined guidelines and criteria in both carbon and non-carbon components, and determine overlaps across projects and programs, and obviously also assess additionality of projects. Regarding the risk mitigation mechanisms, mainly for leakage and non-permanence, risks that can be mitigated through a variety of mechanisms, including project design, buffers, insurance, or warranties. The risk mitigation mechanism includes the rules for projects to share the risks with jurisdictional or national levels. Then the registry involves having a mechanism to keeping a record of mitigation actions at multiple levels, emission reductions, as well as transaction. It is an essential to track status and compliance with nesting rules. Effective operation requires that governments develop the necessary regulation and administrative processes to mandate and operate registries, such as project approval requirements. The registry is also an important mechanism to keep track of other elements, such as buffer accounts to address non-permanence and leakage, as well as preventing double claims. Then finally, we have the MRB that have to align MRB approaches across scales. This element is important in order to enable comparability of efforts at the national, at the jurisdictional level, the quality of the results, and of course also to ensure the environmental integrity. All these elements will support to address these different technical challenges as additionality, double counting, leakage, permanence, and uncertainty that will be addressed by the if these elements are put in place properly. In conclusion, bring projects into jurisdictional approaches could leverage the participation of private finance. Obviously, the complexity and cost of nesting approaches will vary with the modality chosen by countries, and countries will need to take those into account, as well as the contributions that projects can play in addressing the drivers of deforestation and contributing to enhance jurisdictional or national action. I stop here the presentation. I wish you fruitful discussions during the panel and the coming sessions. I just wanted, before closing, take the opportunity with this last slide to invite you to the third session on climate finance opportunities to foster forest positive agriculture. This session will be the third of 3 online events under the common topic of halting deforestation, approaches and tools for forest positive commodity value chain, organized by FAO and the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries of Japan. The session will be held 20th of October 2021 at 14 hours Central European Time. Interpretation in English, French, and Spanish will be available, and the registration is open in this link. So you are very welcome to register and participate in this session. With that, I thanks and wish you a very good day. Thank you.
So thank you to Mr. Lucio Santos for recording his presentation for us. So before we proceed to our panel session, may I remind our online attendees that you can now post your questions in the Q&A box, which you can find in the menu bar on your screen. You may also ask your questions live later during our open forum. So just kindly use the raise hand feature and wait to be acknowledged, and we will turn on your microphone. So before I also turn over the screen to our moderator, let me introduce to you our three panelists. Mr. Josh Van Vianen is our first panelist. He has conducted extensive research on a diverse range of topics related to conservation, forestry, integrated landscape management, and ecosystem services. Josh also developed a deep understanding of the social and environmental issues surrounding forests and degradation across the tropics while at the Center for International Forest Research, or C4, in Indonesia, which led him to his current role leading project feasibility assessments as technical unit manager for forest carbon. Our second panelist is Mr. Aditya Rakman, who is the Senior Sourcing Manager for Nature-Based Solutions in South Pole. His main activities is leading the Asian sourcing activities to connect projects that does mitigating activities such as forest conservation, deforestation or restoration, and sustainable forest management to the global voluntary market space to access potential carbon financing. Our third speaker is Ms. Susana Velez Holler. He is Vera's Regional Manager for Latin America and the Caribbean. Ms. Susana is a forest engineer from the National University of Colombia. She also specialized in environmental management and has a master's degree in sustainable resource management from the Technical University in Germany. Prior to working at Vera, Ms. Susana worked for a few different institutions, including South Pole, Fundación Natura, and WWF, where she managed different topics such as RED+, development of projects, construction of public policy, and relations with different stakeholders. So with that, I now turn over the screen to Ms. Dada Bacudo to help me moderate the panel session.
Hi, thank you, Tin. And I hope our participants are still with us. It has been a series of PowerPoint presentations, but from now on, we hope to hear in this panel discussion the perspective from the people who are very much closely working with the private sector. So I don't know who will be first to give us a reaction from our esteemed member of the panel on how they feel is jurisdictional sustainability approach something that the private sector wants, and is there a role for the private sector with this approach? Perhaps I should call on, should I call on Jos Van Vrienen to give his presentation?
Sure. I mean, yep. Hi, thanks everybody. Thanks, Christina, and thanks to Lucio and Abstentia. Very interesting presentation. I do have a PowerPoint here that's a short overview of what we do and covers some of the stuff that Lucio discussed. So I'll present that quickly, but I think it won't take long, and then we can get into some of the comments that I have here on the presentation. Okay, so sorry, we usually use Google Meet, so I just have to figure out how to present my screen.
Wow, the whole world has been on Zoom.
I don't know. I'm not sure whether it is. So share screen. Okay. Here we go.
I actually wanted Josh to give a reaction contrary to a presentation, but I'm sure that, yeah, we would.
I'm happy to not give the presentation, just get straight into
Yeah.
the discussion if that's what you would prefer.
No, I've been told that it's a short presentation. Okay. Yeah, thanks, Josh.
So yeah, I'm Josh. I'm actually the technical director at Forest Carbon. So Forest Carbon was founded in 2007. We were initially a largely a consultancy company. We worked a lot with some of the other projects in Indonesia, all through Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. We in 2016 decided to pivot to project development. We worked on our flagship project, which is the Sumatra Marang peatland project. It was verified in 2019. And that's expected to generate 1.4 million credits over the next 47 years per year. And that's a 22,000 hectare project. We've also secured a large amount of investment. I mean, we initially raised 6 million to get SMPP off the ground. And more recently, in exciting news, we've secured an additional 11 million through AXA to support some, the growth of our portfolio. Just to put that in context, when we're talking about RED and, government to government or jurisdictional stuff, we're looking at, the amount of finance that we've raised to get these projects going is almost a third of what was promised, to Indonesia from Norway at 56 million. So in terms of the volume of money that the private sector can mobilize, I think, that's an interesting point. So yeah, over the next 5 years, we're looking to expand our portfolio. We've got a goal to eventually have 250,000 hectares under management. So yeah, there's other projects in Indonesia, but they've been operating for a while. Rimba Raya, Kartingen is one of the most famous ones. They're all fully licensed and they've already generated over the last 10 years, 60 million tons of emissions reductions. So none of these areas that I know of are currently in areas that are looking at jurisdictional approaches. There's some in there's some in Jambi. I think East Kalimantan and Papua have plans to develop or already have been working on jurisdictional approaches. But in terms of where the projects are in Indonesia at the moment, the active projects, they don't currently sit, to the best of my knowledge, under any jurisdictional frameworks. So Lucio presented this graph. I'll just shoot through. The market has been improving. A lot of money is coming in through the voluntary market, and that's a really good sign that there's some confidence there. Early on when we started, it wasn't necessarily like that, and now we're starting to see some real confidence in the market and people willing to invest, so that's great. Same there. And that's a lot to do with businesses and corporate sustainability goals and internal carbon pricing as well. Many of these oil and gas companies have internal carbon prices of $40 to $60. So this is all good news for the market. So I think I'm just going to minimize that. So in terms of the role of private sector, what's our role? We are the private sector, and we conduct private sector conservation. So we need to provide long-term protection of key conservation assets where there are highly localized threats. We can act pretty quickly, find an area that's about to emit tons of carbon, whether it's deforestation or peat degradation, and act relatively quickly to protect that area. We need to ensure transparent emissions reductions accounting and continue to build market confidence, provide strong co-benefits for communities, biodiversity and ecosystem services, and continue ensuring that voluntary carbon mechanisms are built on the trade and sale of high quality carbon credits. I think that's a really important point. Leverage growth in the sector to scale up the number of projects and the positive impacts of climate change mitigations in the private sector, and continually improve processes to accelerate the time to market for new projects. In terms of nesting, we need to ensure that the project level can continue to have positive impacts in the climate space when nested into these national or sub-national jurisdictional programs. And I think another key point here is that post-COVID, economic recovery policies in many places are likely to increase pressure on forests. So I think the private sector has a big role to play here in having project developers that need to be agile enough to quickly act to protect some of these, carbon stocks that are likely to be, at higher risk post-COVID. So I breezed through that quickly. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Josh. I actually had coffee with your colleague Jeffrey Chatelier here in Bali.
Oh, nice.
And he shared his views on jurisdictional sustainability approach. He's not such a fan. So I would probably call you in the second round of conversation and ask your views, possibly mirroring his on maybe some reservations on jurisdictional approach. It would be nice to hear such different points of view, right?
Yeah,
so thanks,
sure.
Josh. Yeah. Thanks, Josh. And I think I see Susanna smiling there, but I would like to maybe call Adi first, if you are okay with that, because Adi, just to break the monotony of PowerPoint, perhaps. So, Adi, are you there? And would you like to give us some insights on the role of the private sector?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ibu Imelda. I'm right here. And thanks again for the opportunity for everyone to sort of speak. I think there's been a lot of interesting materials that was covered in the beginning, and I think I mean, based on some of the experiences we had, myself in South Pole, looking at just project level RED Plus, but also I used to be in Indonesia's RED Plus agencies as well. So there's definitely the benefits of looking at how jurisdictional approaches could sort of benefit RED Plus approaches. And I don't have a presentation with me, so this is sort of a more candid reaction from my end. So I think that in general, a wall-to-wall approach, such as a jurisdictional approach, is indeed interesting, because what it allows is that it allows a sort of a landscape approach that involves all possible actors within an area to contribute to another. But I think I also echo some of our previous speakers, like Philip, for example, that sort of underlines that government leadership is indeed key, because if we draw sort of the experiences from the voluntary carbon market, and I think Josh was mentioning about the current high growth of investor interest in nature-based solutions at project level. I think the main two keys, and I think this was mentioned as well by Ibu Imelda and also Lucio in the past sessions, is that there's really two major keys, which would be clarity and credibility. So if we look at why, some of the reasons why the voluntary carbon markets is growing in the past few months, I think it's, of course, it has something to do with the increased pressure and understanding of sort of companies and investors to sort of contribute to approaches like nature-based solutions. But in another sense is that the question, and I think Matthew mentioned this as well, is that one of the initial challenges was to sort of connect the sources of investment with investable projects. And I think carbon project, or sort of voluntary carbon project at project level, sort of represents those two keys that I mentioned: clarity and credibility, in a way that there's a set methodology. There's people are starting to understand what they're about, what the projects actually do, how do they intervene against trends of deforestation and emissions and things like that. And I think when we look at jurisdictional RED, a lot of those similarities, are carried over, but on steroids, essentially, because you need to think about synchronizing baselines. You need to think about how you set a safeguard mechanism that works across the country or across a certain landscape. For example, you need to talk about an MRV system. You need to talk about GHG inventories. You need to establish like registry systems, funding instruments, and things like that. I think it's the approach could be similar, and thus the effects could be similar, but I think it's just that jurisdictional RED Plus is just very complicated. Indonesia sort of started out, just to use an example from my own backyard. Indonesia started out their jurisdictional RED Plus journey maybe a little over a decade ago, when Norway committed their support to the government. And it has been a long journey to sort of build those building blocks, because it involves not only, when we say government, it's not just one government, is it? It's multiple ministries, it's national government, subnational government. And we talk about investors, we talk about investors that are outside that might be interested in investing, or we talk also about investors that have supply chains there as well. So I think from our point of view, is that I would say it does have its benefits, and I think the promise, if it works, is amazing. It's just that for a jurisdictional approach to sort of work, the government needs to sort of look at installing the right capacity and then executing it. I think RED plus readiness is something that's really important. I think there are many programs like World Bank's FCPF, for example, that has sort of a support to readiness funds to help governments set up RED plus and things like that. And a more technical note, you have institutions like Vera that that can help in technical measurements, such as through their JNR program and things like that. So I think there's definitely a lot of potential, but there is a lot of challenges as well. I mean, compared to setting up a RED Plus project, and in terms of the opportunity, I think I think I really like the fact that you showed. I mean, Ms. Imelda, in your presentation, you looked at the different options of financing and how there are different actors. I mean, when we look at investors, again, investors is not just one group. They have different scopes that they can support. They have different risk appetites. And I think it's just about understanding what's available there. And then again, going back to Philip's point, is that making sure that the government takes a leadership, showing that, hey, I know what I'm doing. This is what I plan to do. I know how to measure performance, and I know how to make sure that I'm going to be able to coordinate all actors, within the landscape. So I think jurisdictional RED Plus is really important, and however, we must never take lightly of the challenges. I think that would be my initial impressions, Imelda. Hope that was helpful.
Thank you very much, Pa Adi. That is very, very rich insight. I was down here writing notes, and I think you have highlighted, and I think Josh would also highlight this as later some of the a bit of caution for jurisdictional approach in terms of the complexity of stakeholders and the key role that government has in the nature of government at the moment, which is quite volatile. So Pa Adi, you mentioned institutions like Vera, who play a key role as well, especially in terms of monitoring, reporting, verification. And we are very privileged to have been joined by Vera representative. I see Ms. Susana and her very, very nice smile. And I hope that you have been so far enjoying the presentations. But Ms. Susana, we would like to hear from you, your perspectives on jurisdictional sustainability approach, and especially its potential for unlocking private sector capital.
Thank you, Imelda, for your nice words and your welcoming. I'm very happy to be here, and it will be strange for you because I work in Latin America and the Caribbean, and you may think, well, why don't you bring someone that is closer to us? But the thing is that we have here in the region very interesting experiences. I had a presentation, but Josh already showed how the market is growing, how the voluntary market has been blooming, and this year has been spectacular. I mean, we thought 2019 was something so good. Then, of course, we had the COVID situation where everything was a little bit strange and stopped a little bit for a while. But then we have this year that is so amazing for the voluntary carbon market. But this is not only because you have voluntary carbon projects, it's because you have commitments from the private sector that they are buying and they are investing in those projects. So you have the huge corporations, and everyone will start talking about BP, Chevron, LATAM, British Airways. You have like these huge corporations doing investments in projects, doing investments in research, in monitoring programs. And then we also have governments introducing carbon taxes, but introducing very specific mechanisms that will allow you to buy offsets instead of paying those carbon taxes. And this has shown a very interesting dynamic in the market, not only because we have new projects, but also because we are having discussions about how to make those projects better, how to improve the standard, how to improve the activities, the monitoring, the MOB, the accountability, everything, because we're facing several challenges. We have the voluntary market, now we have NTCs, we have other compliance markets as CORSIA, we have governments thinking about jurisdictional approaches, and all of this has to come together to really have the environmental integrity that we are expecting and that we're hoping for. So when you see Vera and you see the standards that we manage, Adita already mentioned the JNR approach. We have been thinking for, I think now it's more or less 8 years about jurisdictions, and everyone was telling us like, why are you thinking about jurisdictions? You should be talking about projects. But the reality is that we will evolve to jurisdictions. That's what we are hoping, because there we will lower some specific risks. Leakage, we will lower maybe some risk of double accountability. The challenges are huge, and we understand that. We understand it's not easy. I mean, developing a project, and Josh and Adita can tell you how complex it is, then just bring it and scale that up. You won't have one project, you will have 10 times the problems you have, but you will also have benefits on mixing stakeholders, talking, participating, defining where the investment will be, what you will do with that money. And of course, you have governments from countries, like big countries, bringing money to the table, and not only just, to put the rules, but to help countries understand the rules. So I think that having all the stakeholders in one batch discussing how to have environmental integrity and how to bring the most to the table, it's the key. It's hard. It will take us a couple of years, but we have very interesting lessons learned already from the voluntary market, from the projects, from stakeholders, developers. We have, FAO has been very active, for example, in the region, in the Latin America region, understanding the different challenges for JNR, for different countries. So I think that's the key, starting the discussion, analyzing and understanding where this is going. And of course, making the best of the momentum that private sector has, because they have the money, they want to invest, and they are very excited about what is happening.
Thank you very much, Susana. These are great insights, and this actually makes me think of whether or not is jurisdictional sustainability really the only direction forward? Is this the only approach that is at the moment quite appealing to private sector investment? Because we wouldn't, from FAO's perspective as well, we wouldn't want to push just this sole approach if this has some of the disadvantages or some of the cautionary elements that we need to take into consideration. Foremost of which, I think, from Forest Carbon's perspective, and I think this was also echoed by Adi from South Pole, the volatility of political institutions and political realities. How do we move around it? Sorry, there's someone behind me. How do we move around it? And are there alternatives that we should take into consideration? Because we don't want to just take and advise the government towards only one sole direction. If there are others that you feel would be a better direction to head towards, we'd be very keen to hear from you. So this time around, I would like to maybe start with Adi with this series of questions.
Yeah, thanks, Imelda. I actually think that the whole concept of jurisdictional red is rather sort of the longer term horizon. It's not the current solution that we focus on, but that's something that would be very cool to happen. But we must understand that it is something that is longer term, because you need to make sure that the ingredients are sort of right before you start cooking it as well. So that's why I was talking about the readiness as well. So I think right now, I think examples like, project level interventions where it's been seen that the mitigation activities at project levels can be done, it could be executed, and it could be measured through a scientific methodology that shows that there are emission reductions happening because of that activities in comparison to the baseline scenario, for example. And then there are people who are interested to sort of compensate that activities through purchases of credits or pre-financing or what have you. And then you can sort of develop that into, the jump between the project level and a more portfolio level, if you will. It doesn't have to jump directly into a national RED Plus, for example. There are smaller initiatives, for example. I think in Indonesia, there's this initiative called the Sustainable Districts Platform, where this is driven by some 10 or so district governments, where they establish a platform and where they hold out dialogues between the government agencies, private sectors, non-governments, and they start to sort of experiment in doing pilot projects that are not necessarily the classical reforestation or protection activities, but they also look at sustainable commodities, for example. They look at alternative livelihoods for people in their district that is really accustomed to the situation and also the potential of that district. And I can give you an example. There are districts, for example, where 90% of their area is protected forest. So they can't actually hold out an economy that is forest-based. And that's why they looked at sustainable ways to sort of have NTFP industries, for example, and then cross-learn it with districts that do have a lot of forest and how they sustainably manage their forest. So I think that could be an example of sort of a smaller mini scale jurisdictional approaches that could be considered as well. There are also private platforms like there was a pledge between palm oil plantations, for example, where they would then together they would cross-learn lessons in how they properly could implement policies like NDPE, for example, or associations of timber concessions where they cross-learn how they could implement sustainable forest management. So I think these things, project level or sort of mini portfolio gatherings in a way, I think that could sort of help as well. Not as to not put the pressure on that it has to work now, has to work at national level, again, because it takes a lot of time to build it. And I think we can sort of start slowly moving from project level to maybe district level and whatever. I think every country could have it differently, but that's sort of my current thoughts at the moment, that actually the national, GA approach is sort of the longer term. And now we build onto that instead of waiting for a national mechanism to sort of show up. And then you'll spend, without realizing you spent 10 years, without really actually having anything on the ground because you were waiting for that grand thing to come up.
Thank you, Pa Aditya. A very good illumination of giving us ideas of building blocks, right? Step by step, and these are building blocks. I'd like to hear from Ibu Susana. I don't want to put you at the last one here this time. So Ibu Susana, what do you think of this? Is that really where we're heading? Is that the only direction where we're heading? Jurisdictional.
I feel that we will have a combination of everything, because finally this is a decision of the country, and they have different interests, they have different capabilities, they have different challenges. So we will see different things. We will see even different things inside countries, because we have huge countries like Brazil, where they have a state where they already have some jurisdictional approaches, but maybe other states won't have those jurisdictional approaches. So this will be changing. And when we're talking about jurisdictional approaches, we think mainly about RED, conservation and forest, but then you have also plantations, you have also agriculture, you have biochar, you have other projects per se that may be independent from these jurisdictional approaches, because having everything in one bag is also not good because of the baselines, accountability on different methodologies. So it will be a little bit complicated. So I think we will have a mix. There are specific markets like Corsia. If you don't have a jurisdictional approach, they won't get REDD+ credits, carbon credits, but others, they show interest there. They say, okay, if CORSIA does not want those credits, we want them, we trust that. And another thing that we will see is that we will have not only jurisdictional approach for carbon credits, but for co-benefits. You will have to measure the co-benefits, biodiversity, community protection, so many things that you can relate to a forest that will have to be a little bit more flexible. I don't think there is a unique solution for the climate crisis that we're facing. And this will depend a lot on how countries see the challenge and how they want to face this challenge.
Thank you, Susanna. Hi, Josh.
Hi. I'm happy that Susanna mentioned crisis, because that was one of the points I had. You know, we are in a climate crisis, and I think it also relates to what Aditya was saying, is that, you know, jurisdictional approaches are long-term visions. And, you know, what we need to be doing right now is protecting forests. So who's going to be in the short term, you know, who's going to be doing that? That's going to be us. That's going to be the project developers. Like I mentioned in my presentation, I do think, you know, we are potentially coming into a period of, you know, higher risk for forests, higher risk of emissions in many countries as countries sort of put the focus back on the economy. And countries like Indonesia, where, you know, in many parts of the country, that's largely going to be around agriculture and land use. So I think it's great that, you know, that crisis was mentioned. I also think that talking about, you know, bringing all the stakeholders to the table in these jurisdictional approaches, is that I agree that that's really important. I do have some concerns around, you know, some of these higher level approaches that, you know, they leverage international agencies, international governments, and there's not always a, you know, many of these agencies don't actually like project level REDD. You know, people within them, there's often debates in academia and in other countries about whether project level REDD is the way to go. So if you get into a situation where you have projects that need to be nested into a jurisdictional approach, I think it's very important that the actual projects on the ground are involved. And I think it's quite easy to look over us, really. And I think in terms of risks, you know, from our side, that's a lot about baseline allocations. You know, we have the technical capacity to do this stuff. You know, often the governments don't. I think aligning methodologies is super important. For example, if an FRAL doesn't include the differentiation between planned and unplanned, and then projects are doing planned, planned deforestation projects, and then you're stuck with a lower baseline level, you know, this could happen. And I think same with peat emissions that are not always included or fire emissions included in national baselines. So I think it's really important as we move forward that when we have these multi-stakeholder talks, that the private sector is involved and like actively involved in helping develop a way that we can nest into these projects properly. I mean, everybody's going to have to be nested eventually. That's the feeling we have when that happens. I think we're all unsure, but I think it's more of a long-term vision. And I think we need to address some of the risks.
Thank you, Josh. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Were you saying some, do continue.
Oh yeah, I think just, you know, there's a reason we've managed to de-risk the sector significant to a point now where people are willing, you know, international big companies are willing to put significant amount of money in. If we jump into nested programs and nothing is clear, we're back to a situation where the risk is increased, and you know we could be in a position where, you know, companies are less keen to invest in project level REDD, which is, you know, not a good place to be for us. So I think we need to be super careful on how we approach this.
Thank you, Josh. I think collectively from the panel, what I'm getting is that really making sure that what you have working at the moment is enriching on what you have, building on this towards perhaps this vision of a jurisdictional sustainability. But we have a question. I just would like to ask you the last question, and it's somehow reflecting the question on the chat box. We have a comment from I think from John. who's asking actually that what he's hearing from about jurisdictional doesn't seem to be anything new. It's again leadership by the government and putting up the needed policy infrastructure, including the global context of the carbon market, to pave the way for the private sector to be more engaged. What then is new about jurisdictional? Why if I can just ask each one of you to answer this rather quickly. Why do we think we should head towards jurisdictional though? Is this something that the private sector wants? And what's motivating the private sector to want this? Let me start with Susanna on your view on this.
Yes, I think what is new here is the way we count the emission reductions and the way we prevent leakage and moving deforestation from one place to the other. Why the private sector is interested here? Because they have a huge need. The demand of carbon credits, it's huge. And project by projects, they may not get to have offsets for their claims. So I think that's why they have interest here, to have a more secure supply of offsets.
Thank you, Susanna. Josh?
May I just respond to that quickly? I do agree. I think there is private sector interest in making sure that there's no leakage, additionality, everything's there, it's clear. But there's a counterbalance to that, and that many of these companies are now, when they first started investing, they would be buying year by year. Now we've got like 30-year offtake agreements. They're taking, there's not enough credits in the market essentially. And if you're a company that has already signed an offtake agreement based on current baselines, so you want to, and then we have to nest, and the baselines are reduced, or the emissions reduction output from that project is reduced, and we cannot meet our agreements that we've already had in place. I think there's an additional risk. So it is a counterbalance. You risk potentially damaging some contracts potentially, or like offtake agreements if you have to shift if the goalposts are moving essentially, and that can be quite difficult. But then you get the additional benefits of being very clear about how many emissions reductions you're having and how that's working in the national framework.
Thank you, Josh. I think the idea, I hope John is hearing this, there's more secure because leakage is more contained, perhaps because something to do with a centralized registry. Adi, can you talk more about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I just echo both Susanna and Josh as well. I think mainly there's definitely interest from the private sectors to be involved. But the question has always been how precisely and clarity. Again, it goes back to my initial points, is that I think that clarity part is making people nervous when participating. Therefore, if there is a robust system or paradigm that is implemented, I think that would make everyone a bit more comfortable as well. I think it's the same reason why people were initially maybe a bit skeptical about participating in the voluntary carbon markets, but they are now not. I think it has something to do with the fact that the clarity and the credibility is getting better. I think that's important.
Thank you so much. It has been very, very enlightening and very useful. I hope the panelists won't mind if some of your insights we would add to our study, as it would certainly enrich some of the perspectives. As we all know, it's very hard to find jurisdictional sustainability experts, and we are really learning as we do these knowledge exchange events with FAO's vision of trying to assist the government of which direction really to take and how to do it. So at this point, I would like to thank our panelists for very, very rich insights into the discussion and into the study. I will hand this over now to our moderator, Tim, to the next section of the agenda.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dada, and to our panelists for that very informative discussion. We really learned a lot from the discussion you just had. So before we proceed to the open forum, let us first hear the thoughts or the overall insights of our esteemed discussant. So our discussant is Ms. Reagan Pyro-Mahaki. She is a senior program officer at the RECOFC for landscapes collaboration in a changing climate. Her work focuses on developing a portfolio of landscape programs in 7 focal countries, which established a forest landscape-based approach to achieving social and ecological outcomes at scale. Climate mitigation and resilience are the threads pulling together the landscape level work. This focus on the opportunities for developing bankable nature-based solutions, a community forest landscape-based approach to climate change adaptation, and the piloting of key indicators and landscape level monitoring approaches. Previously, Reagan has worked with WWF Greater Mekong Program, championing conservation in the Dauna-Tenasserim transboundary landscape. So with RECOFTC in various different roles, includes as lead of a civil society network on RED+, and with FAO as long-term consultant on regional forest policy. So let us now hear from Ms. Reagan.
Yes, Ms. Christina, and to all the other organizers of this workshop, thank you very much for inviting myself and RECOF to be a part of this important discussion. I would like to maybe take it in a little bit of a different direction than the previous speakers. So RECOF is formerly the Community Forestry Training Center for the region for Asia Pacific, and has since transformed more along the lines of a broader approach to forests and people. And one of the ways through which we're doing this is by seeing community forests embedded within a broader landscape approach. And jurisdictional versions of this is one of the different forms of landscapes that we recognize. And I would like to maybe touch on the comments in the chat box from Nick, I believe, asking about trends in management that are moving towards more holistic transboundary approaches, ecosystem approaches, ridge to reef, etc. So the previous speakers have already unpacked in detail RED and carbon offsets and voluntary carbon market, and what the opportunities for developing jurisdictional approaches through JNR, Corsia, and the LEAF Coalition, and what that looks like. So I'll maybe, set that aside and just reflect a little bit on what I see as being some of the opportunities for evolving and driving forward the landscape approach at a jurisdictional level within Southeast Asia in particular, over and beyond, over and above RED and the carbon markets. So what I would say is that there is intense demand, whether it's impact investing or otherwise, in developing this pipeline of sustainable projects and bankable nature-based solutions. And there's a real shortage. There is no shortage of capital to go into such projects, such initiatives, into landscapes. But for a number of reasons, there's a challenge in linking the capital, the investments with bankable projects and developing that pipeline of bankable projects. And this is something that RECOF and WWF and other actors have been involved in trying to catalyze and facilitate and work with local communities and multiple stakeholders and sectors on the ground, and trying to develop some of these bankable nature-based solution type of projects that would channel private sector funding into investments that yield both social as well as environmental benefits. And some of the reasons why this is not happening at the scale that we would like to see it is, well, the growing familiarity of the private sector with ESG, and having the systems essentially set up to maximize revenue, to maximize efficiencies. And a landscape approach is oftentimes fundamentally messy and time consuming. You're dealing with, by definition, multiple sectors, multiple stakeholders, and it's very much a process oriented approach, whether it's jurisdictional or whether it's other forms of landscapes. So there's, to some degree, a bit of a mismatch between the design and the structures within the private sector, as well as how smallholders on the ground and how a landscape functions. So there is an important role for NGOs, for potentially state actors, and even multilaterals to support and to catalyze the aggregation of smallholders and these multiple actors on the ground, and actually develop these bankable nature-based solutions and these bankable projects on the ground. NGOs typically do not have the mindset, do not have the skill set or the expertise to develop business models, viable bankable projects, and doing so in the land sector is particularly difficult. It might be somewhat different in energy or other sectors, but in the land use sector, looking at agriculture and forestry and the interface between these, it becomes quite messy, and it becomes quite challenging to identify where investments can actually lead to returns. But I think that this is the opportunity, and this is absolutely the direction it needs to go. And we see a real crowding in of funding and interest. For example, the Dutch Funds for Climate and Development, DFCD, is really supporting landscape level investments by offering seed funds, grants, support to the enabling environment and to the NGOs to be able to develop these bankable business plans. So this is one of the things that, one of the areas that I see quite a bit of opportunity. The discussion around nature-based solutions is very, very positive. And I think, while RED is a subset of that, the broader approach to nature-based solutions is a way to meet these different societal challenges, while either building in or building upon environmental or natural capital. Nature-based approaches, I think, is important. And the fact that the IUCN criteria and definition for nature-based solutions builds in scalability. I think that is really the entry point to scaling up and moving and requiring a landscape approach as opposed to purely project-based. And within RECOFT, we consider community forestry, or as Dada was earlier mentioning, community forest-based management as one of the key opportunities for mobilizing and as a platform for nature-based solutions that can yield financial returns, which is, an essential part of that. Community forestry typically unto itself is not landscape-based, so we're trying to develop models by where that community forest institution is embedded within a broader landscape that includes forests, that includes settlements, it includes infrastructure, and of course includes agriculture. And within Southeast Asia, community forestry as an institution is significant. There is currently 5.9 million hectares of land within the ASEAN region that is considered to be community forestry, and there's targets to bring that up to 8.9 million hectares over various timescales. So I think that could be can and should be a critical component of meeting those societal as well as ecological outcomes, while potentially finding avenues for investment as well as part of an integrated package. And the final point I'll make and reflect on, and it was great to hear from Susanna, from Vera, Vera, as well as the Rainforest Alliance, have developed a standard called land scale, whereby an assessment of the sustainability of landscapes is conducted, and verification of the landscape sustainability on different thematic pillars, integrated thematic pillars takes place. And this includes ecological sustainability, human well-being, governance, as well as productivity. So, you know, your different productive supply chains and commodities as well. So I think that this can be a very important way of adding the metrics, adding that external verification to a landscape approach. And of course, within land scale, a jurisdictional type of landscape is one of 3 different types of landscapes that are recognized. As it stands now, if one is not looking at the jurisdiction, a landscape approach is quite general and variable, and it makes it quite tricky for stakeholders to pin down in practice what that would look like. So I think that the development of standards, of metrics, of parameters against which there can be quantifiable measurement of progress over time on this range of integrated criteria is an important way of moving forward the discussions on jurisdictional sustainability over and above and beyond just limiting it to red. So I think I've taken up my 5 minutes, but those are several of the directions that I think there are real and rapidly expanding opportunities for jurisdictional sustainability within Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Reagan, for your insights and the additional information that you just shared. It also will significantly improve our findings or our project report. So with that, we now open the floor for your questions and clarifications. So I think we have our first question here from Mr. Nick Andrada. We would like to seek clarification on how the JSA would interface with other new management strategies, given that trends in management are moving towards holistic transboundary approaches, such as the ecosystems approach or the ridge to reef approach. So maybe our panelists, and also if Ms. Reagan can also add to this, our panelists can answer Ms. Dada and Ms. Reagan.
I think we could also open it up to the other members of the team, of the study team. But Reagan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah. Actually, I did try to touch on that in my response. And in terms of holistic management strategies, as mentioned, I think that the development of metrics such as the land scale standard for sustainable landscape management, which includes jurisdictional landscapes, is one such approach. And as mentioned, it is integrated, it is holistic. It looks at 4 pillars, including ecosystems, human well-being, governance, and production. So I think that this is a good step in the right direction. I've previously worked on transboundary landscapes, and I think it is absolutely essential, especially in the context of biodiversity conservation. It is not jurisdictional, as in by definition, transboundary, you're including several different states or jurisdictions. It can be very tricky, and this is part of the appeal of a jurisdictional approach, is you're dealing with a single institutional and policy framework. Once it becomes transboundary, within a country, it's possible. Between countries, it's challenging. And bilateral dialogue alone can sometimes be insufficient. And this is where I see a real opportunity, potential, as well as need for multilateral institutions or international organizations to be able to support and catalyze the bilateral discussions between states in transboundary areas. Yeah, so maybe those are my thoughts.
Sana, would you like to add?
No, thank you, Regan, for mentioning the land scale standard or program. I mean, we have been talking about basically carbon markets, but I think that bringing finance to the table will need more. I mentioned co-benefits, and you need to measure those co-benefits. And this is a great way to think about, okay, forest or agriculture or nature-based solutions in general are not only carbon mitigation or carbon capture. You are seeing here other benefits. The land scale approach is very good when you're talking about very specific commodities and how to measure how these commodities are having an impact and how to reduce or improve the impact, because it's not always a bad outcome. And I think that when we speak about boundaries, this is also something that has to be defined. But regional markets in regions with specific features that may be similar can be established. And I think that there we will have also some opportunities to bring more finance to the table.
Thank you, Susanna. The second question here from Miss Nicole Faith Blanco. I think this is for Miss Dada, and Miss Dada also answered this here in the Q&A box, but perhaps Miss Dada can answer this also live. How would the result of this study on JSA be translated into actions in the province of Palawan or benefit the province? Is there a mechanism already for the uptake of the JSA in the province?
Yeah, thank you. And as you said, I have answered it in a way that states that, you know, this is a study commissioned by FAO, and FAO stands as a technical advisory. So it's not something that we can immediately say it's going to be implemented. It's up to the government of Palawan or up to the Philippine government to decide whether this is a direction that they will be happy to take. The role of FAO has been to provide technical guidance and also possibly with this study define further needs on how we could reach towards that end goal. So it is also up to the province of Palawan and the Philippine government to express to FAO, for example, the kind of assistance that they would need should they want to further explore this direction. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Ms. Dada. We also have a question here. I think this is for our panelists. Do you have projects that demonstrate effective climate financing with the participation of private sectors in a jurisdictional sustainability approach? If yes, can you share some of the best practices that we can consider in doing the same in the Philippines?
Tin, I would like to invite Josh, for example, to answer that. They have a very successful project in Sumatra.
Yeah, so yeah, we have a very, like we said, we've got a successful project with Sumatra. It was a project that was in 2015 was exposed to, you know, the very high, the strong El Nino, obviously, and there was a lot of fire. The whole project area was burnt over. I think we have 200 hectares of remaining forest. It was heavily drained, and the peat was, you know, at high risk of burning every year. So we've essentially come in, you know, by accessing private sector finance. We acquired the area, and then we began restoring the ecosystem. Essentially, we straight away started building dams, bringing the water level up and restoring the project. And it's pretty amazing to see the changes that we're already, you know, you can look at the time series across time from a big brown patch in the landscape to a nice green patch. And we've got tigers and a whole lot of other important species, and we have some very strong community development programs around water, education, gender, sustainable livelihoods, health, COVID response, that kind of thing. But in terms of the jurisdictional approaches, we are not inside any current planned jurisdictional approaches. So there is one in Jambi, we're in South Sumatra. I'm not sure of the progress. That's sort of the neighboring province. So I haven't heard of any plans to try a jurisdictional approach in South Sumatra. But some of our pipeline projects are likely to fall into some of these planned jurisdictional areas. So we're trying to keep our finger on the pulse and understand what each of these areas are doing and how they're approaching things, and hoping to be involved in the development of these programs.
Thank you, Josh. Tin, is Mr. Phillips still around? Perhaps he can address this question as well.
Unfortunately, he already left, Ms. Dada. Maybe we can just email him the question, and then we can also email the response of Mr. Phillips to our participants. So we also have a question here from Sir John. What are ways that we can address changing leaderships brought about by the electoral process to strengthen jurisdictional approach in practice? What are the ways we can address changing leaderships?
I'll be happy to. Josh, you're.
I was just going to say it's all about having strong policy, and embedded policy, and ensuring that when you're talking about jurisdictional approaches, it's often like the governor level. It's some national policy. You need to make sure that the national policy framework is strong and well supported, and then the commitments given at the jurisdictional level need to fit within those frameworks and be linked. So that when there is a change of government, which is going to happen every 4 to 6 years, depending, that the policies that remain in place for at least the duration of the approach, which is hopefully very long term. So.
Yeah, and in addition to Josh, I think this question is from John. John, I hope your previous question disappeared from the Q&A chat, but I hope we have been able to give some illuminating answers on the uniqueness of JSA, which is more secure, more providing leakage to centralized registry, for example, avoiding double counting. But also, in regards to your second question now, apart from what Josh has mentioned on stronger policies, I think information campaigns and knowledge exchange events like this involving leadership would help inform political leaders of the appeal of this approach, as our panelists have mentioned, to the private sector. It seems that the private sector is very keen on having less leakage, a more secure credit. So we hope that informing them will increase their support for such an approach.
Thank you, Josh and Ms. Dada. A question also for you, Ms. Dada. From your assessment, is jurisdictional approach feasible in Palawan? If yes, what do you think should be done to get started with it?
Who asked the question, Christine? I want to tailor my answer. I want to edit my answer.
It's
okay, it doesn't matter. I think I will just take on the inspiration from Pa Aditya's response from South Pole, saying that that it takes a lot of building blocks. It's not something that will happen now or in the very near future. And from the team's perspective, and I hope some of the study team members will speak up, there are a lot of big challenges, especially in harmonization of laws through perhaps 2 decades already. There has been efforts to harmonize several laws that are sometimes posing as challenging. So again, it would be good if there's a decision of the government to embark on this journey, on this very long-term vision. Because without that commitment to go into that vision, Palawan is already very much faced with several challenges.
Thank you, Ms. Dada. And the last question may be from Mr. Yuji Enriquez. He raised his hand. Hello? Okay. Hello? Mr. Yuji? Hello, Mr. Yuji?
I think let's just move on if we can.
So with that, thank you very much to our speakers, panelists, and discussant for answering the questions from our participants. So we'll now move on to our synthesis, which will be provided to us by Dr. Nathaniel Bentayan, who is a professor at the Institute of Renewable and Natural Resources at the University of the Philippines, Los Baños. Sir Nel?
Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is quite a challenge for me. It was synthesis on a range of issues, and this is quite interesting. And I had some difficulties trying to put this together in real time. No, so let me just share my screen. Okay, so can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll try another way. Okay. Right. So I'll just resize it a bit. Right. Okay. So this is an attempt at putting together various ideas from different sectors and different personalities who have done a lot of work on the topic. And just to say that it was started by a message or set of messages from Dr. Gregorio of SEARCA saying that unlocking is essentially engaging with the private sector and building upon the efforts of, in particular, Red Plus in the Philippines. Matthew from FAO mentioned also that GSA is not yet well embedded in national frameworks, and there are still information barriers with private sector engagement that's beneficial to local jurisdictions and land uses. And he mentioned also that, of course, this is part of the efforts we are doing in the Philippines, in particular, Palawan, and Dada later on gives an overview and some of the results that we did in our FAO study. So I think also the presentation of Lucio Santos is very insightful especially in the fact that there are already adequate and predictable finance for forests. So there's an urgency of forest financing. Unfortunately, it's still very low comparatively, and the gap, according to Mr. Santos, is 4 to 6 times. Although corporate policies are moving towards responsible business policy by reducing their climate footprint, and this is given by the image or the figure on your screen. Now, RED Plus projects have increased in number and results, and these may overlap with jurisdictional initiatives. And while this happens, it may compromise the environmental integrity. Key considerations, according to Mr. Santos, are consistency across scale of emission reductions. Sorry about the background. And I'd like to show hand in hand the need to address technical challenges of policies as presented by Mr. Santos, and the initial results, the results that we have seen in terms of perhaps what the JSA elements are according to the presentation of data. And this relate to, according to Mr. Santos, the additionality, the double counting, the leakage, which was a topic that was mentioned extensively during the discussion, the permanence and the uncertainty. But in the Philippines, specifically in Palawan, we see that the integrated LR strategy is there, the spatial plan is there, the MRV, in particular the CAVCS and the National Red Plus Council. The policies and incentives should be moved from or transformed from penalties to rewards orientation, and multi-stakeholder governance coordination needs to be improved. And Susana and a few others have mentioned this in particular, especially the VERA initiatives. Sustainable agriculture and the role of the IPs and the ILCs, or the indigenous local communities. So the next part was quite interesting, and I was very engrossed in that discussion. So I'd like to take an attempt to giving some insights on that. So Josh mentioned the role of the private sector, the long-term protection of key conservation assets, the leverage growth for scaling up, improving processes, ensuring RED Plus positive impacts. And this one was quite interesting to me, anticipating post-COVID pressure on forests, which should be prepared for, I think, when we reach that stage. And Mr. Rahman mentioned that growth is due to increased pressure on companies to contribute, and Mrs. Santos mentioned this also. To him, he mentioned the importance of clarity and credibility. Is jurisdictional RED clear and credible? And understanding that it is quite important. There must be a set method and clear understanding. The approach and effects, according to Aditya, is similar, although the promise is amazing. However, we need to install the right capacity building, and execute them correctly. While there are, of course, current challenges and opportunities, which was also discussed during the panel discussion. While Susana mentioned that while the situation in Latin America is different, it has interesting experiences. She mentioned that the market is blooming for voluntary carbon markets because the private sector is buying. However, we need to improve standards, we need to improve activities, improve the MRV system, the registry, etc. All of these have to come together to achieve environmental integrity that we are all hoping for. And I think this is key. Having all the stakeholders, the multi-stakeholders in one table and agreeing is key. Although Josh has some comments on that as well, which is of a challenge, having all multi-stakeholders coming together in one table and agreeing is a challenge, because they all have different interests. So, a challenging question from Dada: is JRED the way to go? Is it the only alternative? According to Aditya, JRED is really a long-term solution. So we must start from the building blocks, build on it, start slowly from projects to leveling up to portfolio, perhaps later on to national level. Susanna mentioned that it will be a combination of everything. Finally, it's a decision of the country. They will have different situations. Different countries will have different situations. And Josh agrees with both of them. However, having all stakeholders agreeing and sitting on one table is a challenge. They will all have to have the right amount of interest. So also there was, I tried to take some insights from the comments of Reagan. Reagan mentioned building upon and scaling up nature-based solutions that can yield financial solutions. Community forestry needs to be embedded within the forest landscape. Right now, there's minimal experiences on that. It must be a holistic management by using metrics to improve quantification and essentially measurement. In general, there are rapidly increasing opportunities for JSA in Southeast Asia. So with that, I think there's promise of JRED in the Philippines, in particular, having operationalizing it at least in Palawan, because the elements are there. We have seen that they are there. From the perspective of FAO and all the other participants and panelists, it is possible, although we are still in the early stages of doing it in the Philippines. No, so with that, I hope I did something that is interesting for everyone and synthesized all the ideas from these sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Nel, for that very comprehensive synthesis of our event. So with that, it has been a highly engaging dialogue. On behalf of SEARCA and the project team, we would like to express our sincere gratitude to everyone for taking the time to join us today. Of course, to FAO as our partner in this event, to our speakers, panelists, and discussants, thank you very much.